Resuming debate, the honourable member for Newmarket, Aurora.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to discuss Bill C-23, which will provide the necessary authority under Canadian law to implement the Land, Rail, Marine and Air Transport Preclearance Agreement, thereby expanding U.S. preclearance operations in Canada and, for the first time, enabling preclearance of cargo and Canadian preclearance operations in the U.S. Preclearance makes travel faster and easier, including for tourist and business travelers alike, and makes it faster and easier for Canadian companies to do business with Americans. It also allows, Mr. Speaker, Canadian travelers to undergo U.S. border procedures while under the protection of Canadian law and, most importantly, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The proposed expansion of preclearance enabled by C-23 has been greeted with enthusiasm by chambers of commerce across the country, by the tourism industry, by the trucking industry, and by government partners, among others. The Mayor of Quebec City, for example, has called it a great victory. Preclearance operations for passengers have been a success story for more than 60 years, but they currently exist in only 8 Canadian airports, and they don't exist for cargo at all. It's time to build on that success, Mr. Speaker. Expansion to new locations and modes of travel requires an agreement with the United States. That agreement has been reached, and the U.S. has passed the legislation needed for implementation in their country with unanimous support in both houses of Congress. No small feat. However, if we don't pass Bill C-23, the agreement will come to naught, and the benefits of preclearance will remain limited to those Canadians who already enjoy them. Nevertheless, throughout this debate, the NDP has been advocating in favour of the existing preclearance framework. According to the member for Vancouver East, the current preclearance system is working well. Similarly, the member for Beloeil-Chambly has said the current preclearance system works well. The member for Esquimalt-Saanich-Sooke has said that preclearance works just fine. And to quote the member for Windsor-Tecumseh, I understand about preclearance. It is working. It exists today. Yes, it does, Mr. Speaker, and I agree that the current framework, which has been in place since 1999, has served Canada well. But the NDP support for it is interesting because back in 1999, when this framework was proposed and debated, that party had a very different take. At the time, the then member for Winnipeg-Transcona said he had concerns about the bill having to do with privacy protection and concerns having to do with the power of U.S. authorities to detain people and concerns that this would be a further application of U.S. law on Canadian soil. The then member for Winnipeg Centre said he had serious reservations about the bill. He said it was too intrusive and a breach of Canadian sovereignty. And he was worried that foreign officers would have the right to hold people and stop people from leaving. He argued that by passing the bill, the House was granting foreign powers on our soil, which we in the NDP do not think is necessary. He went on to declare that the NDP remains firmly opposed to the creation of Canadian offences for resisting or misleading a foreign preclearance officer, and he accused MPs in favour of the bill of being ready to trample on Canadian sovereignty. And he said, and this is my favourite part, that the bill opens up such a can of worms that it should be sent back to the other place for them to try again and take into consideration such basic things as national pride. Mr. Speaker, clearly a couple of decades later, the NDP itself realizes that their concerns back then were overblown. But here we are again. A new preclearance framework is being proposed, and once more, the NDP is sounding the alarm about perceived threats to Canadian sovereignty and perceived powers granted to foreign officers. It wouldn't surprise me one bit, Mr. Speaker, if 20 years from now, New Democrats leap to the defense of C-23 while insisting that any further changes would mark the demise of the sovereignty of Canada. My point, Mr. Speaker, is let's be reasonable. In most respects, C-23 is very similar to the current framework. As concerns authorities to detain, question, search travelers, and seize goods, C-23 is either identical to the existing law or very nearly so. The same is true regarding penalties for obstructing or lying to an officer. And the right to withdraw from a pre-clearance area is maintained. A traveler just has to say who they are and why they're leaving. And the totality of U.S. pre-clearance operations in Canada would be subject to Canadian law, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the Canadian Human Rights Act. The motion that has been put forward by the member for Beloil Chambly asks us to reject C-23 because of what he refers to as the climate of uncertainty at the U.S. border. But it is precisely with legislation like this that we are best able to reduce uncertainty for Canadian travelers. This bill provides a clear legal framework governing the actions of U.S. officers on Canadian soil and requires U.S. officers in Canada to adhere to Canadian legal and constitutional standards. Today, for instance, a Canadian taking the train from Montreal to New York has to disembark after crossing the border and submit to U.S. customs and immigration processes without any Canadian legal protection. With C-23 in place, that traveller could be processed at the train station in Montreal with Canadian constitutional safeguards in force and with Canadian authorities on site. In other words, not only will this legislation bring about substantial economic benefits, and not only will it make trips to the United States quicker and more convenient for Canadian travellers, it will also enhance constitutional and legal protections for those very travellers. With that in mind, Mr. Speaker, I encourage all honourable members to give this bill their full support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.